So imagine that it's just after Christmas and you find yourself in a toy store. And when you're in this toy store, you meet your neighbour, who you hardly ever see, but you saw him in this exact same toy store last year. And you have a chat, and he says, well, what are you doing here? And you say, well, I'm buying that robot dog that was the big thing that everybody had to buy for their kids for Christmas. And there was a shortage before Christmas, so I didn't manage to buy it for my son, Jim. And so here I am. I said I'd buy him one. I couldn't find one before Christmas, and here I am. And your neighbour laughs. And you say, what are you laughing at? And your neighbour says, well, I used to work in marketing for a toy company, and I know how this works. Basically what they do is they market a toy before Christmas, they big up that toy, they make it the thing that everybody wants for this Christmas, and then when it gets to Christmas, oh, surprise, surprise, there's a shortage of that toy. Not everybody can buy that toy. But of course there are lots of other toys. There are lots of other toys you can buy. And then after Christmas, oh, mysteriously, now there's a supply of that toy. And you can come in here today and buy it. You've been manipulated. And you get very annoyed about this. You think, hang on a minute, I've been manipulated by Big Toy. I don't want this to happen. I'm not going to buy that toy. And your neighbour says to you, well, yeah, okay, you could do that. You could stand on that principle that you don't want to be manipulated by the man. But what are you going to say to Jim? You said you'd buy him a robot dog. You're going to have to buy him a robot dog. The point of this story is that commitments are really important. Commitment and consistency is a really, really important principle in how we behave, but also how other people manipulate us into behaving. That's a story taken from a book called Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion, by a chap called Robert Cialdini. And what I'm going to talk about this morning is this whole business of commitment and consistency, not so much in its relation to toys and Christmas and robot dogs, but more in relation to the whole business of project management. I used to, when I did training courses, I used to do an exercise right at the beginning of the training course. And exercise was that I would ask people to write down as many words and phrases as they could think of that they associate with a successful project, with a project that's going well. And almost always, the first two things that people would write down are on time and to budget. So on time and to budget are about keeping our promises, about keeping our word. And so that's what most people think project management is about. It's the first thing they think of when they talk about a project. Rather weirdly, it's very rare that people write down valuable. And it's even more rare that they write down makes money. So this really is what they think project management is about. It's about keeping to time, which is honouring a promise of how long you think something's going to take, and keeping to cost, which is very much associated with how long something's going to take. But there's an irony to this, and it's not an irony you're going to appreciate if you have to manage projects, and that's it. That projects are ironically, projects are inherently uncertain. So what what is happening very often is that we're being asked to commit to something at the very point which is hardest for us to actually commit to something, right at the beginning. And that would be hard by itself if it weren't for the other thing that we've just seen, which is people manipulate our tendency to want to honour our commitments and being consistent with what we said. So it's not just that, in all honesty, we're asked to come up with an estimate of how long something is going to take and how much it's going to cost. Very often that commitment is manipulated in some other way, and typically one of the most typical ways that it's manipulated is we're told, well, if you don't estimate the shortest time and the smallest cost for doing this project, then you're not going to get it, you're not going to get the work. So this is what Robert Cialdini calls commitment and consistency jiu-jitsu. This is a maneuver that people are being put under to honour commitments, because people know instinctively that this is a good way of manipulating people, that people feel bad if they don't honour their commitments. And so this is almost like a standard modus operandi. I don't know why I'm talking in Latin. It's a way of working that people use, is to get the teams that are going to deliver a project to estimate a short space of time and a small cost. Otherwise, they won't get the work. Another thing that happens, so that's like, if you're getting an external team to do the work for you, that's typically a way that commitment and consistency is manipulated. Another way, if you're an internal team, is for somebody senior just to come up with a deadline and come up with a cost and say, well, this is the deadline and this is the cost, and I've committed to it, so you've committed to it. I wish that didn't happen, but it does. And so this is the reality of commitment and consistency, that most of the commitments that we make aren't real commitments. Even if they were, we'd be making them at a point where we have the least information, and we shouldn't really be in the business of making commitments. But most commitments have been manipulated in some way. And so what do we do about this? How do we deal with the fact that pretty much people think commitment and consistency is what project management is about, and most of those commitments have been manipulated in some way? What do we do about it? Well, in his book, Cialdini draws an important distinction. There's a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who's an American writer and poet. He says, "A foolish commitment is the hobgoblin of little minds." I'm not entirely sure what he means by hobgoblin, but I think it's something bad. And the point he's making is foolish commitments, they're not worth it. They're not worth somebody who's intelligent. They're just things that people with small minds think about. And the point that Cialdini makes is this business of foolish commitments. So yes, we all want to honour our commitments, and we all want to keep our promises, and we want to be consistent with our word in sensible situations. But in foolish situations, where either we've been manipulated into making a commitment, or we've had a commitment forced on us that wasn't really our commitment at all, or in situations where we were asked to make a commitment at a point where we couldn't possibly know what was going on, then it would be foolish to stick to that commitment. And there's another aspect of this, which is, so how do you get out of it? If you've made a commitment, how do you get out of it? Well, there are a couple of things you can do. One is, the interesting thing about commitment and consistency is it applies to all of us. So you can get commitments in the other direction. You can get commitments from the people who were extracting commitments from you. The commitment that you want to get from them is that if things emerge that show that initial commitment is troublesome, if things emerge that you need to talk to them about and you need to get fixed that you can't fix within the team, they will talk to you, they will give you a hearing, and they will possibly renegotiate, because what you're really wanting to do is you're wanting to get away from a dynamic where somebody is pointing to a piece of paper and saying, this is your promise, you said this, you would do this, this is what you will do, and you wanting to get into a situation where there's some genuine kind of discussion about what's valuable in the project, what can be done in a sensible amount of time, and what can't. So that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to move away from this kind of slightly hysterical, manipulative situation where somebody's promised something and somebody else is shouting at them to deliver on their promise, to a sensible discussion. And I'm going to end here with a quote from possibly a controversial thinker, Saddam Hussein. Obviously, not everybody's idea of a war hero, but he did have some interesting things to say. He was talking about politics, but I think this also applies to project management. And he said that politics is when you say you're going to do one thing, but you fully intend to do another, and then you end up doing something completely different. And I think that's a reasonably good description of what project management is like. You say that you're going to do one thing, deliver on time and to budget, but if you really understand what's going on with commitment and consistency, you know that that's probably not what's going to happen. You're going to do something else, and then in the end you do something else which is neither of the things that you imagined you were going to do. And I'm here to tell you, I'm here to reassure you that that's okay, provided that in this kind of world that we're in now, which is a kind of grown-up world of politics rather than just keeping promises in a straightforward way, you try and do your best for the client in terms of delivering something that's valuable to them and valuable to their users. But also, and this is really important, you don't do yourself or your team any damage in the process.